We're going to start in a few minutes. If you can take your seats, please. It's plenary number 1. James Foster, if you can please accompany us to the front. And Isidro Zoloaga is going to be the moderator. So we should start.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Isidro Zoloaga from the Universidad Iberoamericana. It's a pleasure to introduce James Foster to this talk. James Foster is Professor of Economics and Carr Chair of International Affairs at the George Washington University. He received his PhD in economics from Cornell University. Professor Foster's research focuses on welfare economics, using economic tools to evaluate and enhance the well-being of people. His joint 1984 econometrica paper with Greer and Thorbecke is one of the most cited papers on poverty and other topics, I might add. It introduces the FGT index, well known to all of us, which has been used in thousands of studies. Other research includes work on economic inequality with Amartya Sen, on the distribution of human development with Luis Felipe López Calva and Miguel Sekeli, on multidimensional poverty with Sabina Alquire, and on literacy with Kaushik Basu. Professor Foster is also Research Fellow of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OFI, Department of International Development, Oxford University, and a member of the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Working Group, Brecker-Friedman Institute for Research in Economics, University of Chicago. And this year he is serving, you are still serving as a World Bank, in the World Bank's Commission of Global Poverty? Just finished, okay. Please welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, hello. Do I hate being up here with this on the table? I hate it. It just drives me crazy. I'd rather come down here. Is it all right? Yeah, okay, good. Because after lunch, you guys are going to be sleeping. And I'm used to teaching classes where people are sleeping. And so I have my techniques to keep people from sleeping. Anyway, thank you for allowing an interloper like me into this conference, because many of you know so much more about mobility than I do. I'm just coming in and seeing it from the distribution point of view, from poverty, from inequality, from welfare, and seeing if some of the lessons we've been able to derive for the last 20, 30 years in the anonymous measurement of distribution might be able to be applied in the non-anonymous realm as well. So, my typical subject matter is size of the distribution, or spread of the distribution, or the base of the distribution, and how they all relate to each other. Most of the time I look at unidimensional indicators like income, but more recently someone convinced me to look at multidimensional measures, and we've been able to construct a good number of multidimensional poverty measures across many, many countries. So here's the picture that I usually face first day in class. Say, students, tell me what this says. How do these things relate to one another? And at the end of the discussion, they realize that all of them relate to each other, often through stochastic dominance, which is linked to welfare. How many are familiar with stochastic dominance here, by the way? You must hold your hand up. So not many. Okay, well then let me give you a quick intro on this graph. Stochastic dominance really has to do with welfare or expected utility, and when it is, that you would say that one choice is better than another unambiguously for all utility functions in the expected utility function that are within a class. And so you say, well, I want to choose the right thing. Maybe it will depend on the utility function. But for these cases, when you can compare things with stochastic dominance, you can make an unambiguous determination. It's that unambiguous determination in utility or expected utility that translates to an unambiguous determination in welfare, which led to the first really interesting result that Tony Atkinson, it was really a earth-shaking result that Tony Atkinson did, relating the Lorenz curve to welfare, and thereby providing a fundamental, an underpinning for all of the stuff that people did thereafter on inequality analysis. In poverty analysis, if you examine the headcount ratio of poverty, which is the percentage of people who are poor, and change the poverty line, and look at the function as the poverty line rises as to how the headcount ratio rises, that gives you the CDF. It turns out that's related directly to first-order stochastic dominance. If you had two vectors of incomes, it means that one of them, when you reorder it, is bigger than the other, or at least no smaller. So all these different notions in anonymous distribution, where we don't really know who anyone is and we don't really care, okay, relate to stochastic dominance. Mobility, however, by reading through a number of papers, working with students who've done work on mobility, I find it really quite disconnected from the other distributional literatures. I mean, there's a few papers that connect them, but not fundamentally quite the way that you see for these other three. And so I avoided the topic for a long time. There were too many approaches. I didn't see them as being grounded in the kinds of literatures that I knew. There was no core underpinning of a ranking like stochastic dominance or Lorenz or poverty dominance. And I didn't know what the link was to welfare. I mean, you're spreading the distribution. Is it more? But I just didn't quite get it. I knew it had to be related to stochastic dominance somehow. But the question is how? So a student who's now at the Census Bureau came to me. Were you on the committee, Shiko? And presented some of the basic results that we now have finally reinterpreted and now feel satisfied to present. So he got me interested in this work and is the co-author on it. So the goal is to link mobility measurement to stochastic dominance and other tools from static distributional analysis, and develop methods that don't say they provide an alternative, intuitive notion of mobility that separates upward and downward mobility. That's going to be the key here. I'm going to separate the two forms of mobility. Quick review of existing mobility methods. I'll run through that breakneck speed because that is irrelevant. Everyone else has talked about it already. Underlying concepts of mobility that I'll be using, measures of upward and downward mobility, and then the mobility curves that are analogous to Lorenz curves. And a couple of applications, if we have time. There are the papers. Existing mobility methods. Now let me get behind. So first, we were talking a second ago about this wonderful coefficient, which has the interpretation given there. With US estimates, you were saying 5% for a 10% increase in parents' income. If a family is poor, then on average, how many generations does it take? You can figure it out with this coefficient for the descendants to have income that's reasonably near the mean. And there are many references of this, including my colleague, well, he's not there, okay. Shortcomings, averaging, of course, always misses changes in income of one type or the other, in this case, the dynamics. In particular, the changes that you've observed in the US over the last 20 years for Hispanics and whites, that the top earners are doing relatively better, but everyone else is doing more or less worse, could have any effect on IG and could go up, go down, increase. So the link between what might be intuitive in the description I just made and that number isn't there, potentially. There's less suitable for comparing subgroups since the measures regression to subgroup mean, not to the population mean, if you apply it solely in the subgroup. Blacks and whites have the same IGE, but if you look at the facts on the ground, black children are doing worse at every parent income level. Black incomes regress to the black mean at the same rate as white incomes regress to the white mean, but there's a fundamental difference there. Transition matrices, we also have talked about, define classes or groups. You can estimate the probabilities of transition, and it does get kind of overall changes in the distribution, not just the average. It explicitly separates out outcomes of children from poor and wealthy households, and this can be hidden in the average. But the shortcomings are something that we used, that we saw, and we've been trying to dispense with in poverty analysis. That it depends on a threshold, and it's an arbitrary threshold. Only movements across the thresholds count as mobility. So important results might be arising because of this. You might not see them because of censoring. In poverty analysis, we allowed a changing cutoff to get so-called poverty orderings, to see the robustness of results. And that will be one of the ways that we'll proceed here. Distance-based mobility indices are not as popular, not as many people use them, but they are now getting closer to what the static distribution folks are used to. These are measures of change or flux, kind of a total change in incomes. The shortcomings are there's no consideration, really, who the heck is gaining or losing income, and where you're starting from when you're gaining or losing is not being taken into account. So our notion of mobility is based on this motivating question. And we saw it in the literature, and we saw tons and tons of discussions of this over the last year, especially with the election. But more so, I've seen in the paper we have many quotes from popular press just to bang it home. The worry, how, will my child be able to do as well as I've done? And if so, how much better or how much worse? So this leads to what I call an oriented distance-based approach, where you're looking at upward versus downward mobility separately. Of course, it depends what status variable you're using. And for most of the discussion, I'll make it sound like I'm looking at absolute, something like income, if indeed we could compare it across the ages like that. So I should mention, though, you can use any indicator that you would like, any relative. You could use ranking as well with the same approach. So here's the notation. We'll assume that we have a bunch of parent and child dyads. Okay, so the data are organized so that we have n many of them. Parents' income is xi, kids yi. We then obtain a mobility pair, which gives each of those two vectors next to each other. As I said, this can be any attainment variable, and I'll talk a little bit about the ordinal case later, but right now let's keep it cardinal, so we can actually take a difference between status, and it makes sense. So the distance measure of Fields and Fay essentially says, how far does every generation move from its parent? The kids move from parents as an absolute value, and averages across all dyads. So it's really mobility as movement. An alternative measure that they provide doesn't use the distance as income, but uses log, which could be justified either in terms of some sort of welfare interpretation, which I'll get back to in a second, or simply a transformation that makes sense. it emphasizes movement at the lower end. In general, you can define a distance measure of mobility using any transformation, V. So V takes the income to another space where we're going to measure distance. And then you'll find the average transformed distances. Okay? The possible properties that V could have are very natural, like in stochastic dominance. You could say that V should increase when the variable underneath V increases. Perhaps it should have, in fact, diminishing returns, which would be V prime greater than 0, V double prime less than 0. The critique of this approach, of course, is that any movement is considered good movement. So, for example, if you use the basic measure from Fields and Fay, and I'm not sure this example has been fixed, so I want you to look at it and tell me if it's correct, would you please? We have P is equal to xy. P prime, the second pair, is equal to xy prime. And x is 528. Y is 768. Y prime is 348. The average distance isn't the same, is it? Or is it? Okay, so let's go through it. 5 goes to 7, or 5 goes to 3. Same change, different direction. 2 goes to 6, 2 goes to 4. So let's imagine that that's a mistake. It isn't the same. It should be 5, 4, 8, and then 5, 4, 8, and then 3, 2, 8. And you'd notice that you would get exactly the same measure of this flux, even though it was going in the other direction. That's the main point. So there's no distinction between upward and lower mobility. So let's have a look at this is the interlude, guys, to make your afternoon very bright and happy. This is from February 2016. It seems like years ago. Warren Buffett channels Keynes. Of course, American children will be better off than their parents. And went on to say, saying the children today would not live as well as their parents was dead wrong. And then he went on to reply to his shareholders that he's a supporter of Hillary. The babies being born in America today are the luckiest crop. This is an important thing. What he's saying, he's trying to reassure the public that all the scare tactics that were being employed to make everyone feel like the kids, that they're doing bad and the kids would do even worse, wasn't true. So he was trying to tie into that same gut feel that was going on in the nation at the time. All right, so let's have some notation after that comfortable interlude. Set of upward movers is QU. So that's the set of all dyads such that the children are doing better than the adult, than the parent. The number of upward movers is little qu. And I use this bracket to mean the number in that set. The incidence of upward mobility, then, is qu divided by the total number of people, number of dyads, actually. This is denoted HU, much like you would denote a head count ratio in poverty. The idea is that this is a crude measure of upward mobility. How many dyads experience a positive upward movement across the generations? It's entirely analogous to the head count ratio, where you identify first who you're interested in this case the upward movers, and aggregate by taking the share of the population. And I'm sure you can see through the example, this one is correct, that we have only one person, one child who is improved over the parents. We have two others that dropped, and So therefore, Q1 is the first person, 1, the first dyad. Little q, u, is just 1 person. And the ratio is 1/3. All right, so 1/3 of these dyads have the upward movement. If you do the same for the downward movers, 2/3 in that example, you get what the definitions are about. I don't need to even go through it. As I indicated before, these are crude measures. They ignore both the extent of the movement and the location of the movement, whether it's between a poor parent and kid or rich parent and kid. You can incorporate distance or the gap, just as we've done in poverty measurement. Define IU, analogous to the income gap. In this case, it's the average improvement, okay, across all the dyads, the pairs that have improved. This is measured in income in this case. Likewise, you can look at the average movement downward, ID. A measure that might be quite natural to those of us who've used poverty analysis would be MU, which is essentially H times I, looking very much like a gap measure. So this would be, intuitively speaking, and I show it on the next page, the average across all n, you're taking the average with respect to n now, of all of these movements, just like you would with a poverty gap. For the example in the previous page, we see that we have I equals 2, the movement. MU is 2 times 1/3 because of H being 1/3. Okay, so therefore 2/3. In the downward way, and excuse me, it says U there, we have downward movement average of 1. But there's 2/3 persons, therefore it's 2/3 also. So this is a very simple augmented measure, if you will. Not just looking at how many of these households are experiencing upward or downward, but by how much in a way which has the frequency as well as the gap or improvement or decrease. The direct definition is given here, as I've said. There's another definition that can be provided using what I call a censored mobility pair. And I do it because I'll use it again elsewhere. I want to create a pair that's really fake by getting rid of all downward movement. By taking any child that went down from the parent and saying, nope, in this ersatz group, ersatz pair, you're going to get your parents' income. Okay, so you censor downward movements but allow upward movements. That's PU. Okay, so it's acting upon the kids' distribution. Likewise, you can censor the upward movements and allow only downward movements. That would give you the PD and the YD. Then it turns out, well, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that if you take the measure that measures both up and down, but you have only up, you get the up. So the MD of P is just the same as applying the M to the PD. So this is helpful for something in just a second. Likewise, for up. We can define, of course, for the two measures that the second measure that Fields and Fay had with log transformation. And in general, you could define the same upward and downward indicators for arbitrary transformations of income. Note carefully that if you add the two together, up and down, you're going to get the Fields and Fay. But instead, we have them separate so that we can have a sense as to whether up is ruling the day or down is ruling the day. Okay? Now, there's an interpretation we can lend to this V, to the log, and I said it before. It is only a rescaling of the income, but it could be viewed as a welfare function. So greater mobility according to the oriented measure has this welfare interpretation. It is that if MUV of P prime is greater than MUV of P, so P prime has more of the upward mobility according to the transformation V, then the intergenerational improvement in welfare, not the dropping of welfare, that's being ignored. The improvement in welfare is higher in P prime than in P. So welfare gains were higher. If the downward direction was bigger in P prime than in P, as measured by MDV, then the intergenerational loss, now ignoring the gain, the intergenerational loss among those who lost in welfare is higher in P prime than P. Note that this welfare is being averaged, either absolutely added up or averaged across the entire population, not just among the people who are moving in up or down in that particular definition. So here's something that was totally unexpected, which led to a very interesting and simple way of understanding the later results on welfare. If you have the same number, n, of dyads in P prime as P, then there's an easy way to make a comparison to see whether you have higher measure of upward mobility. And the way is as follows. You take the parents of one distribution and put it together with the kids of the other distribution, and vice versa. If you have stochastic dominance of the first time, well, not stochastic dominance yet, if the aggregate welfare, if you have higher upward mobility, the aggregate welfare in the parents from the second one and the kids from the first one is larger than the other way around. And the idea is this, that you have a bigger, this keeps changing on me. The idea is this, that the movement from parents to kids upward was larger in P prime. So parents either started lower or kids ended up higher. In the other one, it's closer together. And so if you take, so that means that either the kids were lower and the parents were higher. So if you combine the parents with the kids, you get the lower with lower and higher with higher. And if that comparison holds, this is what we find. So there's a link between this upward dominance, this upward increase in the indicator, and aggregate welfare. So there's clearly results that also hold for downward. Now, these are the measures. They're very simple measures that have been constructed here, just to get a sense of what's happening with these pairs. But the question always arises, and I want to deal with that question, what V, and can you be sure that it's robust to V? That leads us to the topic of dominance and mobility curves. When will all the distance measures, MUV of upward mobility, agree that P prime has more mobility? Well, it clearly depends on what your V, allowable set of V is. Suppose a V prime greater than 0 is our restriction. So income is going to be transformed in a strictly increasing way. Consider the following upward mobility curve. It's the share of families, share of dyads in P for which the parent is below a cutoff, Z, and the child is above. okay? So you're taking an arbitrary cut, like a poverty line, and you're seeing, is it the case, how many, what percentage, are cutting across? Okay. And you do that at another line, and all lines. When you graph this, you get the upward mobility curve. This is motivated by literature on poverty, so let me put it in that context. You have 4 possible outcomes over time: parent, child. Child could go up across the line. You could have it going down. You could have remaining on the same side, high side or low side. So we're looking at upward mobility, and therefore it's this escape from poverty, if you will. Except the line here is just holding fixed. And then we're going to allow it to vary. Okay. Yes. I guess we can build it. Nah, I'll just go ahead and throw it in. So we have various cutoffs here, C1, C2, C3. If we have 20% at C1, we graph 20%. C2, 18%, 15%. Look at it at all possible cutoffs, and that's the upward mobility curve. Okay? All right. We say that P prime dominates P according to the upward mobility curve. It has more upward mobility according to that. If the mobility curve is above everywhere, or at least not below anywhere, it has to be above at least one z. We write this as P prime CU P. It's just like a ranking, like the Lorenz ranking. So the idea is no matter what the cutoff, there's greater or no less upward movement across the line, across each line. It's easily graphed. The role is quite similar to a Lorenz curve for inequality analysis, quite similar to poverty curves in poverty analysis. And so here's the main result in the paper. It's essentially a statement that there are a lot of equivalent things. The equivalent things are helpful in understanding how the different parts fit together. You can see this almost as analogous to an Atkinson theorem or a poverty curve theorem. So the first one is that the mobility curve for P prime dominates the upward mobility curve for P. If you know that, then it's equivalent to saying that the upward mobility measure at V, right, applied to P prime is greater than that applied to P for all V satisfying V prime greater than 0. So as long as you require an increasing transformation, you're always going to have agreement among these measures on upward mobility. The third is said instead of written because you'd have to do more notation. The intergenerational improvement in welfare, and we're only talking about improvement. Sorry about that. I see when I'm shaking my hand, I think this metal is causing the trouble, so I'll throw that out of here. All right. The intergenerational improvement in welfare is higher in P prime than in P for all V satisfying V prime greater than 0. So a welfare interpretation, unambiguous, stochastic dominance in fact. Moreover, if the population size n is the same for the two, then the following statement is equivalent as well. It's that switch condition, that you can simply switch, create a new fake distribution of kids from one, parents from the other, compare them, and you have vector dominance, which is equivalent to stochastic dominance of the first order. So it's very easy to tell for toy examples. Okay. This obviously went into pretty places. So I'll try to explain. Up till now, we've assumed a cardinal variable, but guess what? If you interpret this transformation as one of the allowable transformations of an ordinal variable, you're stating the following result, that choose any cardinalization of this ordinal variable. It'll work. Once it holds, once you have this unambiguous result, every single cardinalization will achieve the same direction. So the mobility curves indicate a strong result. This is analogous to the results I had in the health literature on ordinal inequality, where you pull from the middle, the median. But here it's a pulling from where the parent is. That's the idea for every dyad. Likewise, for the down, the other direction. Also in our work on polarization, very similar thing. Downward mobility, same thing, with the same type of result. There's a conflict, though, with downward mobility, since families themselves would prefer less downward mobility. And there's a conflict between mobility, in the usual sense, and welfare. Another point is that you can throw in any relative variable you want. The welfare interpretation goes away, but the results still stay. And the stochastic dominance results hold for v prime less than 0, v prime greater than 0, v double prime less than 0, the usual increasing but diminishing marginal returns. Results will apply. I didn't give them to you. So this can be applied, and I'm going to breeze through the examples that my students presented because I have 1 minute according to what. Essentially, if you break down the parent population to see how the kids of the parents are doing for each quintile, here are some examples that my student put together. I think, I can't tell you, yes, NLSY. And you see there's a dominance going on here. They are comparable, and it tells you a bit more about what's happening over each of the quintiles. Counterfactual example is trying to compare black-white. It's impossible, so you do your exercise. I think you used Donardo in this, and try to find, by changing characteristics so that you get comparability that is fair, altering the profile of, I think it was the parents' distribution. And another example, which I don't have time. So in summary, I've constructed oriented mobility measures to help understand upward and lower mobility, linked it to welfare, and constructed this mobility curve, series of mobility curves, upwards and downwards, representing the unambiguous ranking. By the way, status could be multidimensional. Perhaps that could be used in a similar fashion, but we'll see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. We have time for questions. Any questions? François? There is the mic. You have your mic?
Yes, thank you very much, James, for the very nice and very illuminating presentation. I'm not sure that I got everything, but I think I got more or less the intuition of what you are doing. There is only one thing I didn't understand in those two theorems that you have shown in those equivalents. Because the third one was saying that if you have this dominance in terms of the upward dominance, in terms of the upward mobility curve, then you would have more welfare in P prime. But in order to have more welfare, you need to have both. You need to have dominance of the upward mobility curve and the dominance of the downward mobility curve, no?
And so when I say improvement, I'm saying limiting to that group only. That's the result that I have to say. If you talk about downward, you get the opposite result. that more mobility is unambiguously lower welfare among that group. When you want to combine the two, that's where the interesting stuff happens. You will get dominance purely if one is up, the other is less. So that means upward mobility is more, downward mobility is less, then you get dominance in the entire distribution. You're dead right. And it's almost analogous to the results that I had measuring happiness in the paper in Review of Income and Wealth, where you have 4 possibilities. You could have a spread, you could have the two following each other, you could have the two going down, or you could have the spread coming together. It's those 4 cases revealing themselves again here. Right.
Okay, so in that case, the point was that didn't understand well what you meant by improvement, and maybe this should be made a little clearer. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to say is a comment, and it relates to stuff I've done and I'm doing with Gary Fields, which is the fact that in all this, you are assuming that the starting point doesn't matter. That whether you you have an improvement between fathers and sons of some for some quantity, the impact on welfare will be the same, whatever the income of the father. So you might very well say that you put more weight into the status quo, the initial situation matters, and you put more weight on an upward movement for poor people initially than for rich people initially.
So the question that I have is, that is being done through the transformation, if the transformation is correct, if it's got the right curvature. Because if you have the same size change, then that same size change is diminishing in terms of the V function. So that will cover it, but it won't be initial in the sense that you're looking at.
No, I guess my point would be to say that the V of Xi would be conditional on the Yi, which I'm improving from one generation to the next, depends on where I was to start with. In what you are doing, Vy minus Vx is the same if I multiply y and x by 2. I'm sorry. If I add to x and y the same quantity.
Depending on V.
Okay, depending on V.
Yeah.
Okay, but I have to think about this.
Yeah, think about that. We in fact fashioned it in order to get around that problem. But go ahead, Chico.
We have another question from Chico.
So, yeah, this is really very nice. If I'm trying to think of the relation between this and the Fields and Oak directional income movement thing. So what you do is you separate into these two groups, right? So you kind of, okay, I'm going to take only the upward mobile and only the downward mobile and then do that. And I guess the reason you do that is that generates the curves and the stochastic dominance in a way that the Fields and Oak don't. But if you go back to just a complete ordering rather than a partial ordering. So if you forget about dominance for a moment, is it true that if you merely add the upward mobility and the downward mobility movement in your oriented measures, you would get theirs? Is that that's true, right?
Yeah.
It's
just what I said. It is the sum.
It is the sum.
And the only thing I'm doing is splitting it, period.
Splitting it because of what it does for the dominance.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Thank you.
We have another question over there.
So I guess I'm going to ask Francois's question in a different way because I didn't understand the exchange. I think what he was asking was, would you get equivalent welfare gains if rich kids end up 3 times better off than their parents, as if poor kids end up 3 times better off than their parents? And I didn't quite understand the transformation.
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. It depends on the function. Yeah.
Because I think that might be normatively quite important, because you might think, particularly given where you started, given the income inequality in many of these countries, it actually may be less important that my children are 3 times better off than me when they reach my age than the poor kids' children are 3 times better. I think that's
a really interesting
potentially lost
comment.
in the way. Do you know another was a data point, Bashman's? I don't know if Bash is still here. Is Bash still here? Or he stepped out, but his paper's on rank directional mobility. from 4 or 5 years ago?
No.
The whole first 2/3 of your presentation were just making me think Bash's papers on rank directional take a very similar approach.
For ranking, that's great.
Yeah, and his
his
curves show you rank directional mobility by 5 percentiles, 10 percentiles, 20 percentiles, based on your starting percentile, upward and downward. So they're really nice, and I just think so I do think there's an area of mobility research that's more consistent with your approach than you suggested.
That's very interesting. So,
and Bash
not
is
here
around.
right now, right?
He was around, yeah. And then my last point is about this relative absolute distinction when it comes to the nature of zero-sum upward-downward mobility. So I've done quite a bit of work on the need for downward mobility from the top in order to have relative, right?
Yes.
Because it's zero-sum. Happiness is not zero-sum. Everyone can get happier.
That's right.
Absolute mobility is not zero-sum. Everybody can be better off than their parents.
Right.
But relative mobility is necessarily zero-sum. So I'm just not... You've gone for an absolute measure by the sounds of it, although...
I have, yes.
In which case there's no trade-off at all. So everybody can be absolutely mobile.
Absolutely.
So you can have 100% upward mobility.
Indeed.
Okay, so there's no trade-off in your model between the two. You don't need downward mobility in your model.
Well, what do you mean you don't need it?
Well, you need it in relative. You need it if you want upward relative mobility. You need downward relative mobility to the same extent, right? Mathematically.
I see what you're saying. You're saying that it's implied by it because of the zero, as you call it, zero sum.
Yeah, because of the zero sum. But you don't have a zero sum function.
And I don't need positive either. I can have it going straight down like it has in many places.
Yeah. Okay.
So and that would be a terrible thing, and it would be stark and would be in your face in ways the relative would not. Because the relative would say, happiness is occurring because I've risen up in the relative scale, even though I'm destitute now. It's like what happened in Europe with the relative poverty that we saw recently when the Baltic states, saw poverty going away as a result of the poverty line falling.
But equally, it works the other way around. Is that if I'm relatively downwardly mobile by a quintile, but massively absolutely better off, I feel more comfortable about that than I would. So Steve Perlstein, post writer, brilliantly put it as, if everyone's driving at 50, you don't mind if someone overtakes you going 60. But if everyone's in gridlock, you get really pissed when someone cuts you off. And so that kind of connection between, if everyone's getting better.
We can go back and forth on this forever. I agree with you. That's right. Relative. One thing is, though, that relative, I guess the main results that we're getting in terms of U.S. were no change, and the ones that we discussed, those were all rank results, whereas the absolute would be, of course, very, very, very different. Right. Yeah.
By, in some sense, choosing your field this way, don't you, in some sense, make the problem a lot easier? Because if we're talking about relative mobility, it would seem you'd have to have a theory about why people have endowments and why they have outcomes before you could have any kind of normative view on what's happening, right? But here's a world where you just get a lump of stuff, and then you get another lump of stuff, and then we're thinking about, well, what's a better ordering or whatever of these? So I guess.
But isn't that what theorists do?
Right. Well, I was going to call upon the cruel philosophers who said, isn't that just like jumping up and down on the finish line and saying, I've won, I've won?
Well, it depends how long you've run before you jumped up and down. Anyway, thanks.
Now, Francois.
I guess another way of putting what I expressed very badly earlier, and thank you very much for making my remark more intelligible. The point is that if you say that you are interested in the utility of a dyad, the utility of X and Y, so you have all those pairs, and you say, okay, one pair is providing some, I will be giving some value to this XY pair. The way in which you do that, you do it in some kind of additive way, in the sense that if you take the cross derivative of the Vy minus Vx, or the opposite, you'll have 0. And the point is that you may not want to have something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is really a very minor point.
But it is it's a simplification. I think that's exactly what it is.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I agree with that.
Okay, we are on time. Thank you, James. Thank you.
we have a few minutes for a coffee break, but we should start at 3:45. Should we continue? Okay. So why don't we just continue with session 3 about social mobility in the Americas. If the speakers can come to the front, Carlos Antonio Costa Ribeiro, Michelle Jackson, and Patricio Solís. Juan Enrique Huerta is going to be the moderator.